In this episode, we start by tackling a topic that can feel like a loophole until you understand what it really is. A compensating control that legitimately achieves the same security objective when a stated requirement cannot be met exactly as written. For brand new learners, the hardest part is realizing that compensating controls are not about clever wording or finding a shortcut, because assessors can see through that immediately. Instead, they are about protecting cardholder data with equal or stronger security outcomes when the original method does not fit your environment for a real, defensible reason. This matters in the payment card industry, PCI, world because payment environments include older systems, unusual architectures, and business constraints, and sometimes the perfect textbook control is not possible right now. When you learn to engineer compensating controls properly, you learn how to think in outcomes, evidence, and risk reduction, which is exactly how an assessor evaluates your decisions. The goal is not to get away with less security, but to build security that stands up to scrutiny because it is logically sound, clearly documented, and proven effective. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A compensating control begins with a clear understanding of what a requirement is trying to accomplish, because you cannot substitute an alternative if you do not understand the objective you are substituting for. Requirements in PCI are rarely arbitrary. They exist to prevent common attack paths, to reduce the chance of data exposure, or to improve detection and response when something goes wrong. If a requirement is about restricting access, the objective is not the specific tool or process named in the requirement, but the outcome of limiting who can reach sensitive systems and data. If a requirement is about encryption, the objective is not simply using an encryption feature, but ensuring that data is not readable to unauthorized parties during movement or storage. Beginners often try to jump straight to proposing an alternative without first stating the intent, and that mistake leads to weak arguments that feel like substitutions without purpose. When you discipline yourself to articulate the control objective in plain language, you create the foundation that lets an assessor see you are solving the right problem. The next idea to lock in is that compensating controls are usually allowed only when a requirement cannot be met as stated due to legitimate constraints, and those constraints must be specific and defensible. Saying it is hard, expensive, or inconvenient is not the kind of constraint that wins assessor confidence, because every security control has some friction. A legitimate constraint sounds more like an architectural limitation, a technical incompatibility, a business model reality, or a system feature gap that cannot be changed quickly without creating unacceptable operational risk. Even then, compensating controls are not a permanent excuse. They are often treated as a way to maintain strong security while the underlying issue is being addressed. For beginners, it helps to think of the constraint as the reason you cannot use the default method, but not as a reason to accept weaker protection. The constraint must be paired with a plan that produces equivalent or stronger security, and the assessor will focus on whether your alternative truly closes the same risk path. A strong compensating control is engineered, not improvised, which means it is designed from the threat path backward. You begin by asking what could go wrong if the original requirement is not met, and then you identify how an attacker or mistake would exploit that gap to reach the cardholder data environment, CDE. Once you can describe that path clearly, you can design alternative protections that break the path in more than one place, ideally with layered defenses. For example, if a system cannot support a particular hardening method, you might compensate by tightening network isolation, strengthening access controls, improving monitoring, and limiting what data the system can ever see. This layered approach matters because assessors are skeptical of single-point substitutions that claim to fully replace a requirement with one different control. They want to see that you understand the risk and that your alternative reduces the likelihood and impact in a measurable way. Engineering the control with the threat path in mind makes your design feel purposeful, not like a patch. A crucial principle is that compensating controls must be at least as effective as the original requirement, and in many cases they should be stronger to overcome the uncertainty of being different. This does not mean you must build a complicated fortress, but it does mean you must address the same objective with comparable reliability and coverage. If the original requirement provides consistent prevention, your compensating control cannot rely only on weak detection that happens long after the fact. If the original requirement reduces exposure broadly, your alternative cannot cover only a narrow slice of the environment while leaving easy bypass routes. Beginners sometimes think effectiveness is a vague judgment, but you can make it concrete by tying it to outcomes like reducing access paths, reducing data exposure, reducing time to detection, and improving containment. You can also evaluate effectiveness by asking how the alternative behaves when things are messy, such as during outages, emergency access, or unusual transaction spikes. The closer your alternative comes to predictable, sustained protection, the easier it is for an assessor to approve it. Because assessors rely on evidence, your compensating control must come with a clear proof story that shows it is real, working, and maintained over time. Evidence is not just a document that says we have a compensating control. It is a coherent set of artifacts and explanations that show the control exists, that it applies to the right scope, and that it produces the intended result. For example, if your compensating control depends on isolation, the evidence should demonstrate that isolation is enforced and validated, not just drawn in a diagram. If it depends on monitoring, the evidence should demonstrate that monitoring is operating reliably and that suspicious activity would be noticed and acted on quickly. Beginners often assume that describing a control is enough, but assessors are trained to distinguish description from verification. A strong approach anticipates assessor questions and answers them with clear logic, consistent documentation, and results that align with your data flow understanding. When evidence and reasoning match, approval becomes much more likely. It also helps to understand the difference between compensating controls and alternative implementations that still satisfy the requirement as written, because mixing these ideas leads to confusion. Sometimes a requirement allows multiple methods, and choosing one method over another is not compensation. It is simply selecting an allowed option. Compensation comes into play when you cannot meet the requirement's stated approach and need to show that your alternative meets the intent at an equivalent or stronger level. Beginners can accidentally overuse the term compensating control for normal design choices, which can make your overall compliance story feel messy and more questionable than it needs to be. Assessors tend to scrutinize compensating controls more heavily because they are exceptions, and exceptions demand stronger justification. A disciplined mindset is to use compensating controls only when truly necessary and to keep their number small by designing the environment to meet requirements directly whenever possible. When you reserve compensation for genuine edge cases, each one receives the attention it needs to be defensible. A common place compensating controls appear is around older systems or specialized devices that cannot be modified easily, and the beginner mistake is to compensate with paperwork rather than protection. If a legacy component cannot support modern security features, your compensation should focus on reducing its exposure and limiting the damage it could cause if compromised. That might mean ensuring it never stores the primary account number, PAN, in the first place, reducing where it sits in the payment flow, or keeping it behind strong segmentation so only a small, controlled set of systems can reach it. It also means controlling administrative access tightly, because a legacy system often becomes an attractive target due to weaker built-in defenses. Monitoring becomes especially important here, but monitoring must be connected to fast response, not just logging for later. The key is that the compensating control should change the risk landscape, not just describe why the landscape is imperfect. When the design measurably reduces attack paths, it feels like engineering rather than excuse-making. Another area where compensating controls get misunderstood is encryption, because beginners may believe that any obfuscation or masking is a substitute for proper protection. If a requirement exists to ensure data is unreadable to unauthorized parties, your alternative must produce that outcome reliably, including during transit and storage contexts that matter. Tokenization can reduce the presence of sensitive data across many systems, but it is not automatically a compensating control unless it clearly replaces the requirement's objective for the affected systems, and you can prove the sensitive data is truly not present. Truncation can reduce stored exposure, but it does not help if full values still appear in logs, exports, or upstream processing. A compensating control in this area often requires you to show that the sensitive data is either eliminated from the system's reach or protected by another robust mechanism that yields equivalent confidentiality. Assessors will look for clarity about what data exists where and whether the alternative truly prevents disclosure. If your design leaves ambiguity about where full data appears, your compensating argument becomes fragile. Compensating controls often involve multiple layers, and you should be able to explain why each layer exists and how the layers reinforce each other. Layering is important because it reduces the chance that a single failure defeats the entire protection strategy, which is especially valuable when the original requirement could not be met. For example, if you cannot implement a particular authentication method on a system, you might compensate by limiting network reachability to that system, requiring strong authentication on the jump point that accesses it, monitoring administrative sessions closely, and reducing privileges so that even successful access yields limited capability. The layers matter because they address different parts of the threat path: entry, movement, privilege, and detection. Beginners sometimes create layers that overlap without adding real coverage, which can create complexity without effectiveness. A well-engineered layer design is simple to explain. Each layer has a clear purpose tied to a risk, and together they deliver the security outcome the original requirement was intended to provide. Documentation quality is a major factor in whether assessors approve compensating controls, not because documentation replaces security, but because it reveals whether you truly understand what you built. A strong compensating control write-up clearly states the original requirement's objective, explains why the requirement cannot be met as written, and describes the alternative control in enough detail that its operation is understandable. It also describes how the alternative meets or exceeds the objective, including the scope of where it applies and the assumptions it relies on. Most importantly, it connects to evidence and testing, explaining how you validate the control and how you maintain it through change management and monitoring. Beginners sometimes write vague narratives filled with broad claims like robust security and industry best practices, which do not help an assessor evaluate equivalence. Clear writing, anchored in objective and proof, is itself a signal of maturity and reduces assessor uncertainty. When the story is coherent, the assessor can focus on verifying rather than decoding what you mean. Testing and validation are where many compensating controls fail, because teams build an alternative but do not prove it works in a way that matches the objective. Validation should be tied to the outcome you claim, such as showing that unauthorized access is blocked, that sensitive data does not exist in a system, or that monitoring would detect suspicious behavior within a time window that limits damage. This does not mean you must describe technical test procedures in a step-by-step way, but you do need to show that verification exists and that it is repeatable. Assessors tend to trust controls more when validation is periodic, documented, and connected to change, because environments drift and compensating designs can erode. Beginners often underestimate how quickly drift can happen through a small configuration change or a new integration that creates an unexpected pathway into the CDE. A strong compensating control includes a plan for revalidation, because without it, the control becomes a one-time promise rather than an ongoing protection. When validation is built into the design, approval becomes much more realistic. It is also essential to connect compensating controls to scope, because many compensating strategies depend on isolating or limiting what is in the CDE and what can impact it. If your alternative control assumes that a system is isolated, you must ensure that the isolation is real and that connected to and could impact relationships are understood. If your alternative depends on keeping sensitive data out of certain systems, you must ensure that data flows are mapped and that accidental storage is prevented in logs, files, and backups. A compensating control that does not match scope reality will fail under questioning, because the assessor will discover that the control does not apply where it needs to. Beginners sometimes treat scope as a separate compliance step, but for compensating controls, it is inseparable from effectiveness. The alternative must cover the true risk boundary, not the boundary you wish you had. When you tie compensation to accurate scope and data flow evidence, you remove a major source of doubt. A final beginner misconception is thinking that compensating controls are mainly about persuading an assessor, as if success depends on the right words rather than the right design. In reality, the assessor's approval is a byproduct of your control being objective-driven, risk-aware, and evidence-supported, not a result of a clever argument. If your alternative is weaker than the requirement, or if your evidence is thin, no amount of confidence will fix that gap. If your alternative is strong, clearly mapped to intent, and validated in a repeatable way, approval becomes the natural outcome because the assessor can see equivalence or improvement. This mindset also keeps you honest, because it encourages you to build controls you would trust even if nobody were grading you. When you design for real-world security outcomes, you automatically create the kind of compensating control that can stand up to scrutiny. That is what it means to engineer, not negotiate, your way to compliance. By the end of this lesson, the main takeaway is that compensating controls are a disciplined way to achieve PCI security objectives when the default method is not possible, and they succeed only when they are engineered around risk paths and proven with credible evidence. You begin with intent, you justify constraints with specificity, and you build layered protections that meet or exceed the original requirement's effectiveness across the correct scope. You document the control as a coherent story tied to verification, and you validate it over time so drift does not quietly undermine your alternative. When you approach compensating controls this way, you stop seeing them as exceptions and start seeing them as outcome-based engineering that protects the CDE with clarity and rigor. Most importantly, you build a habit of thinking like an assessor and like a defender at the same time, which is exactly the mindset the internal security assessor, ISA, certification is trying to develop.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.